We are here today with Colin Murphy, the Group Strategy Director for Droga5, an advertising agency based in New York City. Colin, thanks for being here.
You're very welcome.
When you begin working with a new brand or on a new campaign, what are the first questions you ask? What kind of data do you need to get started?
Yeah, so the way that we like to think about things, it's actually a pretty simple construct, but then there can be a lot of depth within it. Is we look at the world through four lenses. We call them the four C's, which is the company, the category, the consumer, and culture. Within each of those, there's different amounts of research that you might need to do depending on what you already have available, and then what new questions you need to answer. But we get a lot out of digging really deep into what the company's all about, what the DNA and the soul of the organization might be about, like what the brand really stands for, not just what it's selling, what people's ambitions are, where they want it to go. That's the first part of it, and the second part of it is the category. So what else is happening around the business that this brand is in? What white space might there be? What other opportunities? What are the tropes and things that you want to avoid? What are the category dynamics? Then the third part is consumer insight, which is probably the one that most people would be familiar with. But what we like to try and do there is try and get a little deeper, try and get into something that maybe hasn't been uncovered by normal research. But then because consumers are really good at telling you where they are now, what they're thinking about at the moment, the fourth is often the most interesting to us, which is the cultural piece. So which is where are what's happening in the culture that surrounds the subject matter that you're thinking about, because what's happening there is where the customers will be in the future. So we also do a lot of research there, very qualitative research, often with cultural leaders and experts that can help us unlock a little bit about where things are going to go rather than where they are now.
Mm-hmm. Now, and it's interesting because it kind of ties in with my next question, is I was reading an article about the agency, and an executive from Coke Zero had a really interesting quote about Droga5 when they said that Droga5, they don't impose their brand on the brand.
Yeah.
And so I was curious, what does that mean to you in terms of, not making it about Droga5, but making it more about the brand, but also, you want people to know it's you in some sense.
Yeah, I think the thing that's consistent about what we do is the influence that we're trying to achieve. So it's more about the way that it performs rather than the content of the work. I think the process I was just talking about with the four C's is going to be different for every brand in every different situation because it has different customers, and they deserve a fresh start every time. So every brand should have its own totally unique point of view, its own purpose, and its own whatever executional elements and style are right for that situation. I think what we try and do is we have a set of values that we hold that are always the same in how we work. So we're always creatively led, strategically driven, digitally native, and humanity obsessed, which is just it's just a set of principles that I think will always apply, and they will always get us to the right product for the problem at hand. But I think the similarities work in terms of philosophy more than strategy or execution for any particular brand.
Mm. Now, these days, I guess when someone like me would usually think of advertising, you think of maybe just a commercial or an ad. But today, it's about a full campaign. It's about multi-platform. And a big one of those is social media. And I wondered, when you're planning for campaigns these days, how do you determine the right content for each platform? And then also, how do you plan for, virality? Droga5 has been lucky enough to have campaigns that have gone viral. So, for example, you guys were behind the Newcastle Ale. This was what our Super Bowl commercial would have been campaign, for example, and that did go viral.
Yeah.
But you can't really plan for virality. So how do you kind of walk that type of?
I think that's right. Virality is something that you are rewarded with if you create something that people really get value from. So, if something's very entertaining or very useful, you have a chance of it becoming viral, but you plan for being entertaining or useful, not for being viral. That's something that you have the privilege of being the benefactor of if you create something that people genuinely want. So I think that's the first part of it. But more generally, we have after we've done the brand strategy part of what I was talking about with the four C's, there's a just as robust communications planning process where we think about what are the tasks that communications need to achieve, what are the right channels for achieving those tasks, and then what is the right content to fill those channels. So it's all part of a plan which is far broader than any one particular piece of content, and you just pull the right levers at the right time.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about a campaign that I think you really recently worked on. Now, this was a campaign by Dixie, which is they make cups, they make plates.
Sure.
And this was a campaign that was planned around the message of hashtag Go Dark for Dinner. And what it was is encouraging people to take a dinner, take a meal with their family, but without their devices. And this was partly based on, I think, a survey that Dixie helped do, which showed that most people don't do that, which I know from my own experience, it's really hard to do, even no matter how much you want to. Now, can you take me through a little bit about how you work with the brand to decide, like, this was the right matchup for the brand in terms of this is, we want to promote the brand, but we also want to promote this particular message to people, this sort of thing going on in the culture.
Yeah.
And how do you kind of strike that balance of, obviously in the end, Dixie wants people to buy Dixie cups. But at the same time, you're also sort of encouraging this more altruistic message of we also want you to spend time with your family.
Yeah, so I mean, I think they're two branches of the same thought for the brand, which is that what we really wanted to do is find a different way of thinking about what disposable products can do for people. So there is, it's fairly common to talk about disposable products as things that can save you time. But we thought it was really interesting to think about actually what if it's about making your time better, And one thing that we found when we were doing our research into what we thought the brand could, the positioning the brand could take, was we were finding out about that people were really looking for more emotional presence in the moments that they had around their meal times, and we actually thought that the plate was a tool that could help you do that. So once you had established that that's what we wanted the brand to stand for, it then became a fairly natural evolution of it to then think about, so what are the enemies of emotional presence? And the biggest one that we found from doing the survey and from other sources were mobile phones. It's the one thing that just like punctures the little bubble that you really want to try and create around meal times.
It's its own bubble.
Exactly, and people love those moments, and Dixie has a place in that moment, and so it's totally right, I think, for that brand to stand up for protecting that moment.
And I also find it interesting with some of these campaigns, like with the Dixie campaign, and then also with the one that you guys have, the ones that you have done around Honey Made, Graham Crackers, which has looked at kind of various different types of families. The one I watched actually was about non-traditional families, and they were blended families. So parents had gotten divorced and then gotten remarried, and it focused on the child who is spending time in both households and also has siblings in both households. It was interesting to me because I'm a stepmom.
Right.
But what was interesting to me is just with that and with Dixie, it's these longer kind of documentary length.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even call them ads. And it was interesting, I guess, how do you do you start with that and kind of break it down into the smaller pieces that then become the commercial, the social media, or do you start with the small and take it to the big, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the way that we really think about it is, what do we want the brand to be known for, and then what's the right way of telling the story? And often with the examples where we're getting into quite big cultural discussions, it deserves a longer format way of bringing it to life. So it'll be more about what's the right way of telling the story that we're wanting to tell, and then commercial. There's a media plan to fill as well. So then if it requires breaking down into smaller segments, then you do that. But I definitely would think about it more in a top-down way, which is what's the story we want to tell, what's the best way of telling it, and then what are the right executions to do it.
And now that brings me actually to another campaign. So you guys recently launched, I think it's Under Armour's first global campaign around soccer or football, as we call it, or football as most people call it, soccer as we call it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're probably wrong. But how do you, when you're working on a global campaign, I mean, I guess even just the wording sort of shows the differences right there between the culture here and culture in other places. When you're working on a global campaign, I mean, how are you able to kind of keep that balance where you're reaching out to it's such a diverse group of people just in one country in the world that's expanded on by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or a million times. So how are you able to how do you strategize for a campaign that's global?
Yeah.
How does that make it different? How does that change things?
It's really difficult. I think when you start getting into it, you realize quite how much of the discussion that we have with one another, movies, music, advertising, anything, like how much of it does rely on local nuance and local context. But what you're looking for, I think, in that particular example, is you're always looking for what's the highest common factor that unites everybody that you're trying to speak to about the subject that you're trying to speak to them about. So, luckily, I think with that campaign, we had a very specific audience, which was young football players, and they are united by football. And actually, there's an attitude that really brings all those guys together, which is about the mental strength that it takes to just keep on getting up and facing challenges over and over and over again, which is what you can see in the work. And actually, it was great. We used our global network to validate that. That was a thought that we had, and we spoke to actually. scouts and coaches and people who are involved with teaching young kids soccer, and that's what they thought it was. And then we tested that hypothesis in different countries to see if it was a thing that held true. And it did, and that was great. So that came from the sport itself, with the thing that united all those people at that time. But yeah, you have to find something that's universal, and that can be challenging.
Now, with you're saying you do a lot of cultural research in terms of trying to bring campaigns to life. Now, with so we're in sort of a period right now where millennials are becoming the dominant consumer group, and then behind them we have, I guess, what people are calling either Generation Z or MTV is calling them the founders. How does, as they become kind of the majority among consumers, how does that change the way you approach campaigns? I mean, are you doing it differently than you would for, say, the majority baby boomer audience or even the greatest generation before them, although that was...
Definitely. I mean, the inputs that you take, I mean, I don't think there's anything specifically, we would approach it with the same specificity as we would with any audience, you know? I mean, the fact that they're bound by an age group is true, but it's by the by, really. Like for example, with the Under Armour campaign, we were looking at kids of a certain age that play football, but football was the thing that was uniting them. So, we will always, from both an insights point of view and especially from a media point of view, look at how the group of people that we're thinking about behave and how they think. I think specifically for the groups that you're asking about, I think there are certain brand behaviors that are becoming more important as time goes on, but I don't even think they're necessarily isolated to Gen Z and Gen Y. But I think they're things like transparency, for example. I think that we're in an environment where people demand transparency from brands. It's the interaction that a brand has with its audience is so direct now that there's an expectation from customers, and particularly from young ones, that they will have a transparent and honest relationship with the brand that they're talking to, and they're also fine with having a relationship with brands. I think they expect there to be discourse and they expect it to be honest, but they're fine with having a relationship with brands, which I think is something that may be more true of that group than others. Some other examples, I think, are personalization. I think there's a lot of room now. There are a lot of tools available to brands to personalize messages, and I think that's another thing that's becoming an expectation from people. Standards can be set outside of advertising. Like the kind of personal service that's the standard that's set by companies like Uber or something else, where people are using very personal data to provide a better service. That's setting the standard now that brands are expected to live up to, and so I think personalization is another really big theme.
I'm curious. I'm wondering when you're working with a brand on a particular campaign. I mean, what do you do if they're coming to you with something that maybe is the opposite of what you're coming at them with? I mean, how do you arrive at kind of the middle ground of what what it's going to be in the end? I mean,
I think generally we want to work as closely as possible with our clients and with everybody else who's involved in the creation of the work, and I think. There shouldn't really be surprises, I think if the iteration of progress towards whatever it is you're going to do should mean that you're really more together than apart on most decisions. I think generally it's better to pick a path and do it properly than it is to water it down with compromise. But yeah, really, I mean, those are decisions that you should be making together and informing with strategy and with research, so that you should rarely be too many million miles away from one another.
So my final question is one that we actually ask of a lot of people that come here to our studio, which is what gets you up in the morning, and conversely, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's great about what we're doing at the moment is we're doing the world's best creative work on bigger and bigger canvases. So I get really excited about that, about seeing if we can maintain the same level of creative integrity, but do it on the biggest possible scale. And then in terms of what keeps me up at night, I think a big part of what we've got to manage, and not just in terms of media, but in terms of messaging and audiences, and is about simplifying complexity. And I think that's the hardest part of our job. And in everything we do, it's about trying to make very complicated things very simple. And I think that could be the thing that keeps you up at night.
Great, Colin. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.